Hello, welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. Now this week I'd like to start talking about templates. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of templates in one week because this is quite a vast subject that I feel like I can bring something new and something more than what you would have seen just by following along in the other video tutorials and in the documentation, because there are some subtleties to understand with this topic. So this week I'm going to focus just on the concept of master templates. And then next week what we can do is we can start to talk about action templates. So to get started in this discussion, I also need to differentiate the way that we do things between Animate and Animate Pro. The way that we do things in Animate Pro and Harmony is the same. So when I show you Animate and Animate Pro, the same thing will apply for Harmony that does for Animate Pro. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start out in Animate first, and for those of you who are using Animate, you will know that it is a layer-based compositing system. So what that means is that you don't have a network view that you're using to string together the hierarchy that defines your characters. What you have instead is you have a timeline with layers, and then you drag and drop those layers on top of each other to indent them, thus creating your hierarchy here. So since Animate is a layer-based compositing system only, we only have the timeline accessible for when we're doing things like creating templates. And when you're creating templates, it's important to understand that there's a difference between what happens on the left side of the timeline over here and what happens on the right side of the timeline. And when you're creating things from the left side of the timeline, this is how we create a master template. Creating templates from the right side of the timeline is going to be creating action templates. So we won't talk about the right side of the timeline until next week. This week we're going to focus on the left side of the timeline. So there's a couple of concepts to be aware of when you're creating a master template. The first thing is that you really want to have a master peg, and a master peg that is the parent of all of the other drawing layers there, so that you can collapse everything inside that peg. That way, when you're creating your master template, you can select the master peg and it will automatically select everything inside of it. It's very important to have a master peg. And then the other thing that's very important is it's very important to have a keyframe on the first frame of your layer here. And the reason for this is that sometimes you do things like you nudge elements in space in order to set the Z depth, especially when you have something like this character where you have all three views on the same timeline here. In this case, there might be some nudging that's taking place, like the arm might be nudged in front on one keyframe here, on one key pose, and it might be nudged in behind on a different one, like on this first one it might be behind. So you need to have a keyframe on the first frame of your master template in order to define all of those functions and all of those values, and to make sure that you're keeping that Z depth information in there. And so in this case I can see that I already do have a keyframe on the first frame of each pose here, but if you didn't, then you can just collapse everything inside your master peg, and then you can select the first frame, and then you can hit F6, which is going to create your keyframe. And it's in there as an insert keyframe in your right click menu. So after you have collapsed everything inside a master peg, and after you have created a keyframe on the first frame, now what we can do is we can drag and drop into the library in order to create our master template. Do not, however, drag into the symbols library. There is a difference here between the symbols library and the template libraries that you'll find underneath. And the symbols library refers to symbols that are local to this scene. For example, it looks like they have a few symbols that define certain drawing elements, that probably they're using a symbol to gather together an arm and a patch, for example. That's a good reason to use a symbol. But symbols cannot be copied from one scene to another scene directly. So if I open up a new scene, I will not see these symbols in that new scene. These symbols are local to this scene. If you want to create templates that will be available for multiple scenes, then you need to save them somewhere else. Now the default location where you can save something is the Animate library. And this library, if you mouse over it, you can see that it's going to show you where it's pointing to on your file system. So I'm using a Mac right now, so it's pointing to users and then my username, documents, Toon Boom Animate. If you are on a Windows machine, it's going to be inside My Documents and then Toon Boom Animate. And so inside that library, it's just a folder where it's going to save that information. So there's nothing really special about this folder, and I want to explain that briefly so that you understand that you can point to any folder here. For example, I've opened up the desktop, and the reason I opened up the desktop is because I had saved some images in here that I might want to drag and drop back in. You can right-click here and you can open any library. A library is simply a folder on your file system. So let's say if I want to go into my Documents directory and I want to add a new folder that I'll call my Special Library. It's just a folder that you've created in your file system. And then now this folder is a place where I can store template information. And it automatically will show this folder inside of my library window when I look at new scenes because of the fact that I have done that open library thing in here. If you don't see the library that you're interested in, just go ahead and do the open library again. Now if I try to drag my template in here, you'll notice I get the no entry sign. It's not going to let me do it. And the reason for that is that there's a lock on this folder. And all folders are locked by default when you open your scene to prevent you from accidentally dragging and dropping things in your library, because this can make your library very cluttered. So if you want to unlock it, you can just right-click and select Write to Modify, which gives me the right or the ability to modify this drawing layer. And whoops, it looks like I somehow cloned that guy. Okay, so now that I've got my library open and the right to modify, I can select from the left-hand side of the timeline and I can drag and drop it into my library. And when you do that, it will pop up a little rename dialog because it tries to find its own idea of what to name this template, but it might not be the best name from your perspective. So this one I can call Karate Rabbit Master, and I can get rid of the rest of the information there. And then I can just leave it like that. And now I've got this template in my library. Now, something that some people do, by the way, and I just want to make sure that you guys are exposed to this, is some people will have separated rigs for the front, the three-quarter, the side, the different views. They'll have separate rigs. So what happens in that case is they have one master rig for the three-quarter. They have a completely separate master rig for the front, a completely separate one from the profile. And then when you're switching from one, from one view to the other, what they'll do is they'll drag it as separated timelines. I know I've mentioned the word separated timelines a couple of times, but you might not know what that means exactly. So now when I drag that into my scene, let's pretend that this one is my front view, and I'll just, sort of cheat that by deleting some of the other stuff. So the top one is my front view, and I'm going to make the bottom one my side view, or my three-quarter view. And I'll just delete the exposure on both of those. So now I have two different drawings, or two different frames here. I've got one rig for the front view and one rig for the side view. So people that prefer to work with separated timelines, there are some advantages and disadvantages to working this way. The advantages are that you don't have to worry about Z depth changes. You don't have to key or nudge elements in Z depth because they'll always be in the same spot for that view. And then the disadvantage is that you can't swap directly from one to the other on the same timeline. So that means that, let's say, if I know that I want to have the front view until frame 10, I can just extend the exposure until frame 10, and then I will now swap over to the three-quarter view on frame 11, and I can hold that one until frame 20. And so they are completely separated. They're not sort of sharing the same timeline. So that's what I mean when I say separated timelines. And so separated timelines are sometimes easier to work with in terms of rigging them. They might be easier to animate, but it's a little bit trickier to deal with the exposure. So it's really a personal preference thing. I know a lot of studios that work with one timeline, and I know a lot of studios that work with separated timelines. But I wanted to expose you to that concept so that you can find out what's going to work best for you. Now, the last thing that we should mention in terms of working with your master template is that sometimes you might figure out that something isn't working right, and you need to go back and adjust your template. And you can right-click on your template and do an Edit Template. And when you do this, what it does is it sort of opens up a separate mini scene, and that scene is your template. And you can make modifications to your template here. I need to warn you right now at this stage that if you make modifications to your master template, and you already have action templates that are referring to that master template, you could get yourself into trouble. Because what happens is, when you use a master template, the master template defines your overall rig. If you, for example, change the order of layers in your timeline, and then you try to drag and drop an action template back on top of it, if the order is different, it won't drag on properly. There are things that you can do, though, in your master template. One of the things that's done a lot is adding new drawings, because let's take the hands as an excellent example. Hands are often, this is the case with hands. You know, you might be creating a whole bunch of new hands for one particular episode, and then you want to make sure that your hands are available for everyone else who's using this rig after the fact. So if that's the case, and you want to make sure that you can add some new hands in here, you can always just add hands directly in your master template. Or if you've already created them in a scene, you can temporarily drag and drop them into a library and just label that template hands. And then you can drag and drop the template hands back into your master template. I will make one word of caution though. When you're working this way, when you're adding things to templates, when you're changing templates, I highly recommend that you make a copy of the master template before you make any additions on it. That way you still have the original master template, but I can take my copy, let's pretend this is my copy of my master template, and I can go back and I can add a new hand. I just duplicated the hand using that duplicate button, and let's say if I want to just use my brush tool to add a thumb in there or something. So now I have a new hand, and it's been added to my master template, so I now have access to this when I open my master template in a new scene. So now that I've saved that, I need to actually save it in here, and if you want to, you can also save as a new version, and that's often a good idea. If you didn't already copy the template before editing it, it's probably a good idea to save and copy at the same time. And then you just hit the close, and close is now going to close that template, and we can go back to our scene. Now, one thing that you need to be aware of though is templates that have already been dragged into your scene will not include the new information that I've added into my master template. And the reason for that is that the copies that when you drag and drop your master template into your scene, it's creating a copy or an instance of the original one. And we did that deliberately because it's often the case that animators want to really change the rig a lot as they're animating. They might be adding a bunch of things. They might be deliberately skewing and squashing and stretching and bouncing and all this other stuff. And if a team of people are all sharing the same master rig and one animator does something that is going to affect somebody else's animation, it's too dangerous. So the way that we did this is when you drag and drop your master template into your scene, now you can make any modifications that you want on your master template, and it won't mess up the original in your library. And if you get to the case where you want to have access to some of those things that are in the master in a scene that's already in progress, then you can just make some smaller templates of those things that you want to access. So for example, if I added extra hands, I could just have a hand template here, and I can drag and drop it into my scene to add those drawings into my scene, and then update the original template in here. So that was a lot of stuff to mention on the subject of master templates. I'm not going to repeat everything I just said when I go to Animate Pro, but let's take a look at Animate Pro, and this is the same thing that it would be for Harmony. But there are a couple of differences. Okay, so now the first major difference when we're talking about master templates in Animate Pro and Harmony is that now we're dealing with a node-based compositing system. So it's very important to understand the difference between working in the timeline and working in the network when it comes to creating rigs. And what happens is that the timeline, if I look at the connections of the elements here in my timeline, the timeline can only display so much information. It's limited in what it can display in terms of these parent-child relationships. For example, if one element is a parent of another and it's a child of a different one, but that one is a parent of a child of a thing, the timeline can't display all that. It only can display direct parent-child relationships. If I look in my network view though, and forgive me that it's a little bit, there's a lot of stuff in here, but you can even see just when you look at some of these effects, that you have the mouth that goes into a color override, that goes into a cutter, and that's going into a separate color override, and there might even be a third copy of the mouth going down to the composite. These sorts of connections are much more difficult to display in the timeline. And for that reason, if you try to do the same thing that we just did in Animate, and if you create your master template by dragging and dropping the left side of your timeline into your library, it might work. It might, but it might not. And it's not worth taking the chance. So the best thing to do is to select the node, and usually in Animate Pro and Harmony you'll create a group, and that group will contain your rig. And it might even have subgroups inside of it. It probably would be a good idea for it to have subgroups inside of it. But in this case they all have the rig all in one major group here. But you just need to have one master group that is going to contain the entire rig, and then you can select this group and you can do a Control-C or Command-C on Mac. And then if you go into your library, we still have to do that same thing that we did before, where we right-click and we select Write to Modify, and then we can select the right side of the library and do our Control or Command-V, and then that's going to pop up that same rename dialog, and it does make its attempt to find a good name for this. So let's just give it a better name, Karate Rabbit Master, just like we did with Animate. And so that's going to create now our master template here, and that's much more safe to do it that way than it is to do it in the timeline in Animate Pro. So I just want to point that out because it is important to understand that the connections that it shows here are not exactly what it's showing over here. And if you're dealing with simple rigs, it's fine to do it in the left side of the timeline, but I would recommend that you get in the force of habit of using your network view instead. And then there's just one other thing I want to mention, and this character isn't the best example of how to do this because it hasn't been set up this way, but let's say sometimes what you want to do is you want to have a character that is, let's say you're working with separated timelines. You've got the front view on one, you've got the front view on one template, you've got the side view on a different template, so on and so forth. What you might also want to do is you might want to create some mini templates, for example, for the head. And I'm just going to simulate that by sticking, oh, it can't group it, sorry, I need to, it's like not a very good connection because I got a bunch of different things going on. Let's just try a couple of these. Let's just pretend. Let's try a couple of those. Those should group together. Let's group. Alright, so let's pretend that this group right here represents the head. And it represents the head from the front view. You might just want to create a rig or a template out of the head for the front view, and out of the head for the side view, and out of the head, and so on and so forth. And the reason is that sometimes you might be working in the front view, but you might want to swap out just the head to go from one view to another view. And one way of doing that is to have the different heads and then to play with the exposure of the different heads as well. So let me just simulate this by pretending that these are different. I'm sorry for the not having a very good example open for you guys here, but this is a bit more of a complicated rigging concept. And what I'll try to do is I'll try to expand this later on by coming up with a rig that actually has this in it. But let's say that one of these is the front head and one of these is the 3/4 head. Then you can control the position of both of these heads at the same time by making them share a peg. So let's pretend this peg is connected to both of these heads. Then you control the position with the master peg for both heads, and then you can swap the exposure for each head, kind of like what I showed you in Animate a minute ago when I had the front view and the side view on separated timelines. In this case now we're having multiple heads within one character group, and then we're going to swap the exposure on the timelines of those heads. And by having one master peg, when you swap the exposure, if you're animating things with the master peg in the right place, then those heads will swap in the right place. And if they don't swap in the right place, it's not the end of the world. You just go back and you move it, and you make sure that you have one peg that is the parent of all of your head elements, and then you can move them all together. And so that concept I know is a little bit more advanced, and what I'll try to do is I'll try to prepare an example next week that's going to show that concept a little bit better. But the main concept that I wanted us to talk about today in terms of master templates was that when you're working in Animate, you need to save your master template from the left side of the library. When you're working in Animate Pro or Harmony, you need to save your master template from a grouped module in your network. And in both cases, you select the right to modify and you stick it in your library. And this library can be any folder on your file system. So that's what I want to talk about for this week. I will continue talking about templates next week. We are going to talk about action templates and swapping in drawings, and hopefully I can also show you a bit more of a sophisticated example of swapping heads out and that sort of thing. So take care and see you next week.